So, my name's Mr. Russo. We're going to be doing a flipped video for the American Revolution. To help us out, we have Tony, Dakota, and Zach. So, let's go ahead and get started. If you don't have notes for this, you would want to go grab them out of the bin. Or if you don't have these, you can just use regular Cornell notes or a piece of paper. So the very first thing we're going to look at today is I want to remind you of the hook activity for this. So the hook activity for this assignment was the question, what would it be like, the good things and the bad things, if you had to move out of your house? Do you two remember like what one of the good things about moving out of your house would be?
Yeah.
Freedom.
Freedom? So freedom. And then what would be some of the bad things?
Bills.
Bills? Having a good job.
Bills.
The reason why I did that as your hook for this is because technically you guys live like with your parents or families, right? And you have to follow their rules. As soon as you guys move out, you're going to be on, and then you kind of get to make your own rules. And that's a very similar situation to what happens with the 13 colonies. They go from following the king's rules and parliament's rules to stopping, becoming independent, and following their rules. So that's kind of how this is going to work, and hopefully that'll help you throughout the unit. So, does anybody have any questions right off the bat?
No.
All right, then let's get right into it. So the first reason, or the first thing you'll see on your notes, is the question why. Why do we need to study this? Why is it important? The main reason why we're studying this is because this is the first time since like the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, that the people in a country decide that they want to be free and have their own type of government where people are able to be independent. The reason why that's so important is because if you can have a government where the people are free, then they are way better off. They're way more successful, way more prosperous than if they have a government where somebody's in control telling you what to do. So this is the first time since the Roman Republic where this happens again. And it ends up transforming all of modern history. Because once the United States does this, lots of countries follow in our footsteps. So this is like the birth of freedom and prosperity, not just for the United States, but for the world. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right, so what are we going to write for why? I would put something like, it's the birth of freedom and prosperity. So freedom and, I guess it's the birth of freedom and prosperity. A few words we're going to need to know. The first one is cause and effect. Cause is basically when something happens, and the effect is the result. So that's what I would have you write there. The cause is when something happens, and the effect is the result. So if I have a pen in my hand and I open it up, that's what happens. And then what's the result? Falls. Cause and effect. Does that make sense? All right, next up. Revolution. This is the American Revolution unit, right? So I wanted to very quickly talk about what that word is. So the word revolution itself, if you look at the first part of it, or the prefix, that revol part basically is anytime you have something that's turning or changing. Like a revolver gun is the gun that has like the turning barrel. A revolving door is the door that turns around, right? A revolution is when you have a change of government. So that's what we'll put there. A change of government. Okay, so here we go. Here's what happens, right? So you remember, hopefully learning in the 13 colonies, that you had a group of colonies that belonged to Great Britain. They had to listen to the rules of Great Britain until this is when things start to change. And it all starts, if you go back far enough, to what were called the Navigation Acts. Now, hopefully you remember that the Navigation Acts are what happened when England forced the colonists to only trade with them. Now, if you look at our first slide, if we click forward, get it to come up on our list, we'll see kind of a description of what this is. So the Navigation Acts forced the colonists to only trade with England. And there's a reason why. It's this word called mercantilism or mercantilism. I think most people say mercantilism. What way do you guys want to say it? Yeah?
Mercantilism.
Yes. Okay. So what mercantilism was is where you basically had three main countries: England, France, and Spain. And the main thing they wanted to do is be like the richest country in the world. So if you look at this next slide, see if I can get it to go forward. These are 3 maps that show these countries. So take a look right here at England. This was at the peak of the British Empire, but you can see that here's tiny little Britain or England, the little island, and you can see that they controlled everywhere in red. So they had one of the best navies in the world, and they basically went out to the world. They took over chunks of land, and they were looking for gold and silver. And if there wasn't gold and silver there, kind of like the 13 colonies, then they would just look for valuable resources that they could trade to make money. But the number one goal of mercantilism was so that these countries could get as rich as possible. And it wasn't like the people of these countries were necessarily getting rich. It was mostly the king and all the people around him. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm. Is England bigger now?
No, it's the same size. And in fact, it's lost almost all of its colonies. Yes. If you were the king, this is fantastic because you could basically have all the money. But if you were not, if you're just like a regular person in England, you probably didn't see a lot of this wealth. So, worked out great for the king, not so well for the people living in the country. So, if you see here, this is England. We can see what they control. Here's France. France technically was the lighter blue color was the territory they controlled. So this area is what they kind of got later with the darker blue. But you can see that France starts going out into the world trying to find gold and silver. And then take a look at Spain. And Spain kind of hits the jackpot, right? So Spain's here, and they send their boats out to conquer this territory. And they find, especially in South America, and especially in Mexico, they find a lot of gold. And that money comes back to Spain. It makes Spain very powerful. So, who are the 3 richest countries?
England,
France, and Spain.
Yes. And can you see, like, between the 3 of them, how they took over kind of a big chunk of land? So, if you go back to the Navigation Acts, we said that was because England forced the colonists to trade. Why was England forcing the colonists to only trade with England? It's because they didn't want them trading with Spain or France, because that would mean money would be going to Spain and France and not to England. And the King of England didn't want that. He wanted all the money for himself. So, who wants to tell me why the King of England passed the Navigation Acts? It's because he wanted what?
More power.
More power? And did he want any of the colonists' money going to Spain or France? No. He wanted it all for himself. All right, makes sense?
Greedy.
Now, picture yourself being a colonist. You're kind of doing your thing. You're trading with Spain. You're trading with France. You're trading with England. And all of a sudden the king being like, hey, you can't trade with Spain or France anymore. Being like, wait, what? Now I'm only going to make this much money? That would start to make the people what? Kind of irritated and angry. So let's draw next to our Navigation Acts in this column a little angry face to help show that they started to get, just like Zadok said, a little irritated, a little angry. There's my frowny face. You can draw your own. All right, so now we have the colonists that start to get a little irritated. Now, one thing that starts happening between the 3 main countries, Spain, England, and France, is that as they go out into the world, they start kind of bumping into each other when they're taking over this land. And that's what happens here. Notice how France at one point controlled this area, and then England started to control this area. They start fighting over land in North America, like literally like, that's mine, no, that's my land. And they get into a war over a fight. And that's what the French and Indian War was. It was a war between England and France, basically like over land. Now the 13 colonists, originally, they were from England. So the fact that French people were kind of coming in and starting to take their land, they wanted the French to lose. They wanted the French to get out. So when England, the king sent his whole army to beat the French, they do, the colonists were like, yay, the king got rid of the French. They were starting to take our land. So a lot of them fought in it, and they were excited about that. They wanted to kick out the French. So how did the colonists feel about the French Indian War? They were excited because their government, the king, helped get the French out of their area. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's circle England so we know that they won, and then I'll show you this next slide. So there's some more of the details. It was actually a war between England and France. Both England and France were competing for resources. England wins war in almost all of French land in North America. So take a look at this map here. So before the war, the orange here represents the area France controlled, right? And the purple is what England controlled. When France loses, 1763, what happens to all the French possessions? They're gone. So France loses all its North American claims. So how do you think France felt about this fight, the King of France?
Very good.
Enjoy it.
Yes,
Oh,
probably.
no.
Yeah, not good. He's like, well, I just lost a huge chunk of my land. Now how am I supposed to get rich off mercantilism or whatever? Right?
Yeah.
So far, so good? Okay. So, the English win. Everything's working out until you run into a little bit of a problem. Here's what the problem is. Do you see this line right here where it says proclamation line is 1763? Well, when the king wins all this land, colonists start asking, hey, since we have this land now, can we start moving there? The king basically says no. And they're like, wait, why not? It's English land. Shouldn't we as English citizens be able to move into that area? And the king says no. And that's where you see where it says colonists want to settle west of the Appalachians but are blocked by the king. Well, why does the king block them? The reason why the king blocks them is because there were Native Americans who were living there, and the king didn't want to cause any kind of problems. There was a bloody battle called Pontiac's Rebellion where the English were kind of getting into a conflict with the natives, and the king didn't want any more problems. So the king basically says, you can't move here. And that makes the colonists also a little bit mad, irritated, angry. So we can draw another irritated face where they're not happy. What do you mean I can't move west of the Appalachians? That makes me mad. All right. Any questions? Making sense so far? Okay. Next page, if you turn it over to the back side, this takes us to what the British government does as a result of the French and Indian War. So, what the king does is he basically says, hey, we just bailed you guys out. We helped beat the French. We think you guys should pitch in. So the king and parliament passed what's called the Sugar Act of 1764. This is a tax on sugar. And the reason why the king does this is because he wants to try and raise some money for how much it costs to pay for that French and Indian War. So the king's like, hey, we just came and we got rid of the French for you. You guys should pitch in a little bit. So that's why the tax gets passed. Make sense? Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So do you see where it says a response to the French and Indian War?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Why?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But he doesn't stop there. He also wants to get a little bit more money, so he next passes the Stamp Act of 1765, which is a tax on paper goods. Anything that has to do with paper. Playing cards, envelopes, anything like that. So the Stamp Act of 1765 is a tax on paper. Now, the colonists aren't necessarily bothered by this. They can see what the king's coming from. Most colonists would be like, yeah, we can pitch in, whatever, I'll pay the tax. They start to have a problem with the fact that they feel like they don't have a voice in their government, though. So, now we're going to talk about the English government. Do you see on your note where it says king, and then it says parliament?
Mm-hmm.
Well, technically, this was the British government. Now, see the king here? Look at him, check him out with his arms. The king, a lot of people, when you think of England, you think of hearing the king like he has 100% power. The reality was the king did not have 100% power. In fact, the king had most power, but he had to share some with what's called Parliament. And this is a picture of the Parliament building in England, like today. It probably looks similar to this back then. So when we talk about the British government, we're technically talking about the king and Parliament. Now, what was Parliament? Parliament was a group of people from all over England that had a voice in some of the rules that get made. So here's the colonists. This is what they say. They're like, hey, you can tax us, pass your Sugar Act, pass your Stamp Act, but we want a representative in Parliament. Give us one guy that can go to Parliament and represent us colonists over here. And the king says, no. Or however he says no. Either way, he says no. So, do you see below where it says James Otis and Patrick Henry? Colonists start to create a slogan that capture this called no taxation without representation. You can tax us, great, but give us a voice in our government. And the king refuses this to the very end. If the king would have just given the colonist one guy, there's a chance that the whole revolution would have been avoided. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. So, next to king, you could say maybe something like he had most of the power. Most of power. And then next to parliament, you could say that they had a little power. And their little power had to do with making the rules. Okay, so what happens next is the king's collecting this tax, so he starts sending his tax agents to go out and to knock on the stores' doors, say, hey, we're here to collect your sugar and your Stamp Act, please, and collect it. So they start sending tax collectors, and these tax collectors start to become very unpopular. Some of them get grabbed in the alleys, and they start like beating them up, punching in the face, doing horrible things to them. When I say horrible things, what I mean by that is what happens with the tar and feathering. So if you look here, let's go to the next slide. What tar and feathering is basically if this guy was a tax collector, you would have a group of guys, let me go back, that would grab the tax collector, rip off his clothes, completely like naked, and I'm like, I'd compare it to like if you're in high school and somebody stripped your clothes off and shoved you in the cafe, right? You'd be pretty embarrassed. Not just that, they took burning, like tar on the streets, how on a hot day, how it gets all like bubbly and mushy. They would heat tar just like that up even hotter to where it's almost like a liquid, and then they would pour it on you. So picture you being like, walking down the street, gonna go collect my taxes, okay, knock knock, and then like a group of guys got you like, no, what is this, what's happening? And then you're getting like your clothes stripped off and be like, I'm completely naked, I'm nude, and then like them coming with this burning oil and pouring it on you, you'd be like, it burns, right? Really painful, bad thing, right? And then they'd finish you off by hitting you with a pillow with feathers. So you'd be like covered with feathers. You'd be like, oh my God, this is horrible. And then everybody like laughing at you. You being humiliated. You kind of like running home. And then you like getting in the shower. Well, it wouldn't come off very easily. You'd have to like scrub it off and you'd be burned. Get the idea, right? It wasn't pleasant. So that's what tarring and feathering was. It was this humiliating thing that they did to these tax collectors. So next to... Yeah, it was really happened to these poor schmoes, I guess. So next to tax collectors, we could say that maybe they were unpopular. And next to tarring and feathering, I don't know, right? Whatever you want there. What do you think? It hurt? It was embarrassing, humiliating, not fun?
Whatever you want.
Yeah, so this is an example of that. Sometimes they'd even like pour stuff down your throat. It was not a positive experience. You see where it says boycott? Well, not all colonists responded violently by like beating people up and burning them. A lot of colonists are like, hey, let's take a little bit of a less violent approach. Let's do what's called a boycott. Now, do you guys know what a boycott is? It's when you do what? Stop buying something for what? So like, let's say, what would be something I would boycott? All right, let's say you don't like what Hot Cheetos is doing for America. So you could choose to not buy Hot Cheetos, and if enough people did that too, if you could convince all your friends, then Hot Cheetos would probably have to change what they're doing. Now the reason why you're not doing that is because you want people to maybe like lose weight a little bit, right? So that would be your cause. So when you boycott something, you stop buying something to try and get a change, right? And this is what happens here. The colonists start to boycott or stop buying anything made in England. So they stop buying.
But then they can't buy out of England.
Yeah, so they only buy stuff made in the colonies, and a lot of times it'd be more expensive. It wasn't easy. So it was a pain, but they wanted to try and kind of put England in their place. So they stopped buying English goods or British goods. And this starts to work. These are the imports going to Britain. So basically the stuff being sold, colonial imports from Britain. So the stuff sold in the colonies. Do you see in the year 1764 how it was the highest, close to, what is that, like 2 million in British pounds? But then the very next year when the boycott kicks in, how it dips to 1765, it jumps by that much. And then the next year it jumps even further down to where in 1766 it takes a dip. So did the boycott start affecting how much the English were making?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, right? I can show that to the camera. You want to pause it. Now, the other thing I would show you, and the other thing that they did, is a lot of colonists, in addition to the boycott, get together, they meet, and they call this the Stamp Act Congress. They send the king a peaceful letter that says, "Hey king, can you please give us some representation, respect our rights." And guess what happens? What does Parliament and King do? Well, because of what happened here with the boycott, and because they sent a letter, Parliament and the King agree. They get rid of the Stamp Act. So 1766, you see where it says Parliament repeal Stamp Act? They basically get rid of it. So if I'm a colonist, and I hear that my boycott worked, and the king listened to us, how do you think I would feel? Yay, happy. So let's draw a real happy face for the colonists. My government is working for me. This is wonderful. My British accent's pretty weak today. All right, so the colonists get happy. They feel like their government is listening to them. They still don't have representation, but at least the king listened, right? Here's what happens next. The king, 1 year later, passes a new tax. So picture meeting the colonists. I'm all excited, right? Yay, my king listens to me. And then 1 year goes by and they're like, "Hey, did you hear the king passed a new tax?" I'm like, "Wait, what? I thought we got rid of the Stamp Act." He's like, "Oh, this isn't on stamps. This is on a new thing. It's called the Townshend Act. It's on lead, glass, paint, paper, and tea." I'm like, what? So what happens to my mood when the Townshend Acts get passed a year later? I start to get angry again, right? So now I'm going to draw another angry face. So I go from happy to angry, right? I did all that work for the boycott. We met with the Stamp Act Congress. We sent the king a letter. And you're just going to pass another act? So they started to get angry. And the king knows this, so ahead of that, he sends an increase in British troops. Oh, I think, let me see if I had a slide for that. So the king I call this kind of the back and forth of what happens. The king knows that this is going to be a problem, so he starts sending an increase in British troops, especially to cities like Boston. And these troops are just like marching through the streets. And the colonists don't feel very happy, right? And so they start like calling them names, insulting them. They're still freaked out. They don't want to get like arrested or in trouble. But after time goes by, they get bolder and bolder. And this all comes to a head, or comes to happen one night in December in 1770. This becomes known as the Boston Massacre. So picture it being a cold night, and there's a group of British soldiers, and it's nighttime, and there's a lot of colonists that get out. It's late. Maybe they were at the bar drinking. They're a little bit like amped up and angry, and they see some of these troops, and they start calling them names. Now, the insulting names back then, they would call them lobsters because they wear the red uniform, like a lobster's red, or they called them bloody backs or redcoats. So picture these colonists shouting these guys' names, and then them getting like all upset, like, "Can't believe they're calling us that." And then all of a sudden they start throwing snowballs at them. So picture being a British soldier with a gun and these colonists calling you names, and all of a sudden a snowball hits you in the face where you're like, "Ah, that bloody hurt, I'm angry." Then there's even reports that there was like a rock that got thrown or a snowball with a rock in it. And that's where probably what happened was that a rock hits a soldier. He maybe thinks he's under attack, and that's why he shoots. It might have been an accident, they don't know. Either way, somebody shoots a shot, one of the soldiers does, and maybe 6 or 7 other soldiers fire their weapon. And their commanding guy in charge was like, cease fire, cease fire. He never gives the order to fire. Right? And the shooting stops, and the smoke clears away, and there's 5 people laying there. 3 of them, I think, are dead right away. And one of the guys had just got shot in the head. He was like dying, like, ah! One of the first guys on the scene, right there, right behind Zadok, right there, John Adams. John Adams was a lawyer in Boston, and he's one of the first guys on the scene that walks up to one of these dying guys. And he's like, what happened here? And the British soldiers are all looking freaked out, and by now the crowd's all like freaked out. And then they start calling like murderers. Either way, these guys get arrested, and that's what happens. The next morning, a very smart guy that was against the king, we're going to learn about this, he's called the Patriot. His name was Paul Revere. He sees a great opportunity here, and he draws a picture of what he thinks happened. And that's this slide right here. He draws this picture in which the British soldiers are seen as like mowing down the poor, helpless colonists. And he names this the Boston Massacre. A massacre is when like 100 people get killed, or like 1,000, or like 50. It's a big number. Only 5 people were killed for this. So it's really not a massacre. But he calls that, and he puts out this drawing because he knows if all the colonists see it, they're going to start to get angry. That's exactly what he wants. So when people all across the colonies hear about this, they start to freak out. There's people that were loyal to the king that switch. They're like, I was with the king until he murdered these innocent people. I can't believe it. I'm against the king now. So a lot of people's viewpoints change. So this was Paul Revere's version. Have you ever heard the word bias before?
Yeah.
Bias is when you kind of bend the truth in your favor. So is there a place to write that? Yeah, you could say bending the truth to fit your needs or something like that. Bending the truth. So this was Paul Revere's version, and it was bias, trying to make the English look bad. Right? Now, these soldiers all get arrested. They kill these 5 people, so they get arrested and put on trial, right? The commanding officer never ordered them to fire, and so they go to trial. And the same guy, John Adams, is the same guy that ends up like defending the soldiers. And based on the actual trial and the court case, this is a drawing that much more accurately reflects what really happened. See the guy here, he's got the stick. You can kind of see the rocks throwing. You see the British soldiers here are now kind of like surrounded. So see how this is a much more accurate account of what really happened. But that's not what the colonists see, right? So, what are the effects of this? The effects of this in 1770 is that basically the king wants to mellow things out. Things are a little bit crazy, and the colonists starting getting angry. So Parliament and the king basically get rid of the Townshend Acts. So Boston Massacre happens. It looks like the war's going to break out, and the king's like, hey, things are getting kind of crazy. Maybe we should get rid of that tax. And they do. So in 1770, they repeal the Townshend Acts. So they get rid of the tax on lead, glass, paint, paper, but they do leave it on tea. So they leave a little bit of a tax. Now, this mellows the colonists out, and for the next, really 3 years, things are pretty mellow. Does that make sense? Here it says Loyalists and Patriots. These are kind of the 2 sides we talked about. A loyalist is somebody that was loyal to England and the king, so loyal to king. And a patriot is somebody that was against the king. All right. Next up. Move to the next slide. Loyalists believed that the colonists would stay loyal to the king and work with Britain. Patriots believed the colonists would fight the king and become independent. Oh, some of the most hardcore patriots were known as the Sons of Liberty. Sam Adams is one of these guys. He was like ready to fight and die for the cause. So he's not up there. He was cousins with John Adams, though. He was John Adams' cousin. All right, so Remember I always said 3 years go by from 1770 to 1773? Things are kind of mellow. It's known as this weird period where people were just like, okay, I guess we're not going to go to war, and everything calms down and things kind of get back to normal. Until 1773. 1773, the British government does what's called the Tea Act. What the Tea Act does is it creates a monopoly for the East India Company. I know that sounds like fancy schmancy. To make it a little more simple, basically what England does is it forces all the colonists to only buy tea from this British company from their boats. So picture me. Let me think of a British name. Let's say I'm a colonist in Boston. My name is John Adamson, and I own a tea store, right? And I've been selling tea my whole life in Boston. And then in 1773, somebody comes in my tea shop. They open the door and they're like, "Hey, John Adamson, did you hear?" I'm like, "No, what?" They're like, "You can't sell tea anymore." I'm like, "What do you mean I can't sell tea anymore?" Well, who knows how I talk? Well, let's just say I talk like that. "What do you mean I can't sell tea anymore? They just passed the Tea Act. You can only buy tea from the British boats in the harbor." I'd be like, "That's it! I'm not a loyalist anymore. Now I'm a bloody patriot. I'm ready to fight." So that's what happens, and a lot of people get upset over this. So picture me going out at nighttime with some of my buddies. We go to the Boston Harbor on December 16th, 1773. We sneak onto these British boats, the British East India Company boats, and we dump the tea overboard. So picture me, what did I say my name was?
John Adams.
John Adamson. I'm John Adamson, and I'm throwing the tea overboard. Like, this will teach them, ruin my business. And then I come back the next morning, and I wake up, and I'm like, what happened? What happened last night? I got a little crazy. I think I just, did vandalism or something. What happens the next morning is $1 million worth of tea gets dumped overboard by these Sons of Liberty, these extreme patriots, right? And that's what the Boston Tea Party is. Okay? It causes $1 million roughly worth of damage. Now when the king hears about this, he freaks out. That happens December 16th, 1773. Well, later that month, like in January and February, when the king hears that the colonists did this, he's just like, all right, well, I'm going to start doing some pretty hardcore stuff to get these colonists whipped into shape. So he does what's called I can't remember if I have a slide for it. He does what passes what's called as the coercive acts. The coercive acts do really three main things. And you see that on your notes where it says it closed Boston Harbor, it shut down the colonial government, and it also does the Quartering Act, which lets British soldiers stay in the colonists' homes without permission. The colonists renamed these coercive acts because he was trying to coerce them into paying back the $1 million for the tea. The colonists renamed these the Intolerable Acts because they're not going to tolerate it any longer. It was too much. So the king basically says, "Oh yeah, you're going to dump out all my tea? Well, I'm shutting down Boston. Now what are you guys going to do?" And this is where stuff gets kind of crazy. Ready? 1774, that same year, a group of colonists from each colony, 55 total, do what's called the First Continental Congress. 55 delegates meet. They all get together in a hot room in, I want to say Philadelphia, and they meet to figure out what are we going to do. They decide to write the king a letter, because that worked last time, remember? So they write the king a letter saying, "Hey, we have the right to life, liberty, and you protecting our property. And these intolerable acts just aren't working for us." So they write him the letter, "King, we have rights, blah, blah, blah." They fold it up and they send it to him, put it in the mail. It goes in the boat overseas. The king gets him, thinking it's going to be like, "We'll pay back your money for the Boston Tea Party." He's like, "What? They're not paying me back? And they're saying they have rights? Well, I'll show you rights." Look how dramatic this is. "You think you have rights? I'll show you rights." And he tears it up, right? The Congress, before that happened, the Congress says, if the king doesn't listen to us, we'll meet again. Well, the king does that, so guess what they need to do? Meet again. This becomes known as the Second Continental Congress. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So here we go. First Continental Congress, they create the petition, letter to the king. Here they are. This is what it would have looked like. And they decide to meet again if the king doesn't listen, right? While that's going on, there are a group of colonists that start storing up weapons in a city right outside of Boston called Lexington. The British soldiers hear about it, so check this out. Here's Boston right here. Right, you guys know the New England Patriots, the football team?
Yeah.
Their stadium is like in Boston right here. So a group of British soldiers hear about this, and they send their troops to this city over here in Lexington and Concord. Actually, the arms were in Concord. And along the way, a patriot named Paul Revere, same guy that did the painting, warns the people, and they're able to move the guns that were stored up. But the catch is that the British soldiers, when they get to Lexington, they see some of these colonists, and they start to shoot some of them, and the colonists shoot back. And then they get to Concord, there's no guns, and then they start to head back, and some of the colonists decide to shoot them. So do you see where it says, oh yeah, down here. Lexington and Concord, 1775. Minutemen were stockpiling weapons. Well, that's technically like the first battle of the Revolutionary War, right? Now this happens while the colonists hear about this, and so when they meet again for the Second Continental Congress, they basically are like, what are we going to do now? The king didn't listen to us, and some stuff went down at Lexington Concord. Some soldiers were killed. So what they decide to do is they do what's called hoping for peace, but planning for war. So what they decide to do is write one last letter. It becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition. So let's say this was it. Olive Branch Petition. And they write one more peaceful plea. King, we're English citizens. We have rights. Get rid of the Intolerable Acts. Let's work it out. We don't need to fight. They fold it up. Right? Send it to the king over the ocean, right? But while that's away and while they're meeting, they decide to get an army going. Each colony, they basically have them give troops, and they put George Washington in charge of those troops. Now, what does the king do when he gets the Olive Branch Petition?
Takes English.
Yeah, you guys want to do? Who wants to pretend they're King George III? Just tear it up. Whoa! Yes. How does it feel?
Makes him feel like I'm empowered.
And then you'd be like, oh, those colonists, I can't believe it. So when this happens, the king basically sends all the available troops he has to crush it. Then you have the first major battle, which is known as, Second Congress meets, hope for peace, plan for war. This is what it looks like. You have the first battle known as Bunker Hill. Now, in Bunker Hill, 294, here's a picture of what it would have looked like. The colonists were at the top of a hill. The British basically send their boats, and they start marching. So picture being a colonist and seeing that and being like, holy cow, I know we're at the top of the hill and we have an advantage, but there's a lot of British guys coming up at us. So eventually the British take over the hill and they win. So next to Bunker Hill we'll say, what? British win? Yeah. But the colonists fight really pretty bravely. There were about, I think, 20 battles that happened total in the war. Go to the next slide. About 20 battles happened, and from here on out, the colonists start losing, until George Washington does this very brave thing where he does a surprise attack on the British in Trenton. So he sails across kind of in the middle of the night. It's really cold. There's a famous picture of him at the front of the boat. He's got all his guys with him, and they surprise the soldiers that were fighting for the British, and Trenton is the first major win for the colonists. So colonists win big. Okay, so while the fighting's going on, do you remember I said the Second Continental Congress get together and meet? Now they meet off and on throughout all this. It's like a reoccurring meeting that they do. And after a while, when they hear the king did this, they're just like, you know what, forget it. Let's write a an official declaration of our independence. Let's officially break away from England. Now, the ideas to break away from England weren't anything new. Do you see this guy right here? John Locke. You just draw an arrow to his face. John Locke came up with some of these ideas, like life, liberty, and private property. Thomas Paine was another guy that pitched in some of his ideas. He wrote this book called Common Sense, which is actually, Tony, it's right there. You want to grab it? So Thomas Paine, around the same time, writes a book where he says it's common sense to have a government where people have freedom. And a group of 5 guys, Thomas Jefferson, that's a picture of him right there. Where is it? Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, there he is. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams. Right there. They get together, and they're in charge of writing the letter. Jefferson does it. There's a copy of it right up there. It ends up coming out like that. They do some proofreading stuff. They make edits, and they write this declaration. It took 17 days to write. Thomas Jefferson was the main one writing it. And the beginning thing was, we hold these truths to be self-evident or obvious, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed or given by their creators certain unalienable rights or certain rights that can't be taken away, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're going to make a government that's based on those things, not one that's based on mercantilism. We're going to do a new type of government. We're going to make our own rules, just like you guys will make your own rules when you move out someday. On the back page here, you'll see what the Declaration looked like. See where it says preamble? Preamble's what I just read. It was the first chunk. Statement of rights. That was like we have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And then here, this is the charges against the king. So almost the entire document up there is the complaints that the king's doing. So do you see all this? These are some of the complaints. He has made judges dependent on his will alone. He is kept among us times of peace standing armies. He did the quartering acts. He did the tea tax. So this is like the laundry list of all the complaints or grievances. They send it to the king, and it's like the official breakup letter. Declaration of Independence. Keep one for themselves, send one to the king.
So I had to write it by hand?
Yeah, by hand. That's like literally what it would have looked like up there. That's supposed to be like a recreation of it.
It's like copy.
Yeah, so here's what happens next. Even though they write that Declaration of Independence, they still say, hey, they still try and write one last letter, a list of rights and grievances, one last chance of peace. They do write them one last letter like, hey, let's try and work it out. So you got to give it to colonists. Do they try and work it out peacefully? Yeah, but it doesn't really end up working out that way. It's almost like they have to fight. Now, quick side note. Remember how we said in the hook activity how if you move out, you have to make your own rules? Well, that's what happened here. The colonists are not a part of England anymore. They declare their independence, but now they got to make their own rules. So what rules do they write? Dakota, can you close that cabinet? Boom, there they are, right up there. They write the first set of rules, which become known as the Articles of Confederation. This is the first government of the United States. It's quick. It wasn't very well thought out. It's kind of the middle of a war. They just write down some ideas for government. Basically, they say, we don't want a king here. We know that. We want to be free. But they don't put very much else in it. All right. See where it says, comparing the two armies? So, the British were the army that should have won. They were better prepared. They had more people. They had better supplies. They were professional soldiers. The colonists had, the Continental Army had almost no supplies. In fact, a lot of soldiers didn't even have shoes. They were fighting barefoot. You'll see at one point a lot of soldiers didn't even have any clothes. Like there's stories about like basically soldiers fighting kind of like in their underwear. Is that crazy? Because you didn't have enough money to get a shirt. So these guys are extremely poor. They don't have any money, not very well trained, not very well fighting soldiers. They hadn't been trained, but they wanted to fight and win. So they had like passion on their side. And this pays out after Trenton, and especially at this next major battle called Saratoga. 1777, the United States wins in Saratoga. This is another major win. And when the United States wins, France, see where it says the French? France joins in. The reason why France waited so long is because they weren't sure if they were going to win or not. But once the colonists win at Saratoga, they say, we will fight. All right. We're almost done. So if you look here, colonists win Saratoga. Everybody's super excited. The French joins. We get a lot more boats. It's a very positive experience until the winter of 1777. The winter of 77 and 1778, it's winter time, so all the Continental army gets together, and they have to wait it out until it's summertime to start fighting again. So they make camp, like, I don't know, maybe 20 miles outside of New York, and they just have to wait. More than a quarter of the army dies. They don't have food, they don't have supplies. A lot of guys are like, forget this, I'm like all for freedom and everything, but Washington, I don't have shoes, I haven't eaten in like 2 days, and I just got sick, so I have diarrhea now. So this sucks, see you later. So a lot of soldiers are starting to want to leave. And that's when Washington comes in. He brings books in, and he starts reading to his soldiers, quotes about why they should stay and fight. And he starts being like, I know it's tough, I know it's hard, but if we win, it's going to be that much sweeter. So he does convincing speeches, and he convinces the soldiers to stay and fight, and they do, even though a lot of them die. He doesn't just do that, though. He also gets help from some Europeans. He gets this German guy called von Steuben to come in, train his soldiers on how to be better fighters. Von Steuben trains the colonists, the Continental Army, to use bayonets. He gets them all whipped into shape, and they come out being stronger fighters. Remember, a bayonet is where you have a knife on the end of your gun. This pays off big time because in 1781 you have the last final battle in Yorktown, which basically you have the British here. The colonists and the Continental Army surround the British, in addition to the French helping out, and they're able to basically crunch the British. The British lose, the Americans win, and they are officially a independent country. Not just on paper, but officially. A few months later, they work out a peace deal in Paris, France, called the Treaty of Paris, 1783. That officially ends the war. Ben Franklin was there, and the war is done. You have a new country with a new birth of freedom. Now, what you're going to see, what happens next, is that government that they came up with, the Articles of Confederation, they don't really work out. So you're going to see that they need to start meeting again to come up with a new idea for a government, a.k.a. the Constitution. We'll get to that in the next unit. All right, questions?
No.
Okay, and that's it.